The question was so simple, and yet so hard to believe. Did she just ask if she could check my diaper? Julia asked herself. Wait, do you mean, like, you are going to change me? Julia realized immediately after she said it, how crazy it must have sounded. Here she just told this woman that she wore diapers all the time, and that she didn't change herself. Well, if you need to be changed, I would think so. Mrs. Barnard replied slowly. The note from your mom, she grabbed the clipboard again, said that you were back in diapers and asked if there was somebody at the school who could help take care of that. I kind of assumed she was talking about me, but is there somebody else she might have been talking about? A relative or something? Julia felt really stupid. It just wasn't exactly something she was used to or anything. No, Julia replied. No, there isn't anybody like that. I wasn't really thinking, I guess. Well, that's okay. I mean, if you just started wearing diapers last Friday, I imagine this is all pretty new to you still. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to wear diapers again, but I suspect at a minimum it would take some getting used to. But like I said before, I want you to know that I am a professional. I do change diapers all the time. Are going to examine me too? Like a doctor? No. I don't do exams here. I am qualified to do a lot of stuff that doctors do, but I am no pediatrician or anything like that. And moreover, the school isn't paying me to do exams. No, my job is to deal with any student medical issues. Oh, I get it. So, Mrs. Barnard began slowly, do you mind laying down on the bed? Julia suddenly felt as if everything was becoming nearly surreal. The entire conversation was so far from anything she had ever imagined, that being asked to lay down on a bed and let a woman she just met check her diaper seemed no more outrageous than the rest of it. So she said sure, and walked over to the bed and lied down. Mr. Barnard wheeled a chair over to the bed and quickly slid Julia's skirt up just over her waist. That's a different brand of diaper than I have seen before, she said with mild interest. And I would say you could use a change, but looks like this will be a quick job. You obviously don't have a diaper with you, since you left everything in your class. I am pretty sure I have a couple of extras around here someplace. They are not the best diapers in the world, but they are better than a wet one. Mrs. Barnard stood up and went into the storage area. Julia could hear her rummaging around, opening and closing drawers and cabinets. After a minute or two she came back out with a diaper in hand. The diaper looked different than the ones she had at home. It was a light shade of green rather than white and looked smaller. I'm pretty sure this will fit you just fine, Mrs. Barnard said as she came back over to the bed. She set the diaper down on the bed and then grabbed a box of what must have been medical wet wipes. Okay, let's get you out of this wet diaper here. Without any hesitation she grabbed the tapes of Julia's diaper and undid them. In a flash, the diaper was off. A quick once-over of the wet wipes followed, and then a second wet wipe covered the area again. Putting her hands behind Julia's knees, Mrs. Barnard quickly lifted Julia's hips ever so slightly, just enough to slide the new diaper underneath with her other hand. Julia felt all her weight return to the bed and then felt the diaper come up between her legs. Julia heard the sound of the tapes tearing off of their backings and being stuck in place, and then her skirt was frisked back into place. Mrs. Barnard stood up and walked over to the sink and started washing her hands again. Well, there you go. Wow, said Julia as she rolled off the bed and stood up again. That was really fast. My mom is nowhere near that quick. The whole thing had taken maybe 60 seconds. Thanks I guess. I probably have a lot more experience than you, Mom, that's all. Plus that was an easy one, wet diapers are no big deal. The other ones take a bit longer. Anyways, I think you should get back to class now. But please remember to talk to your mom. I am still planning to speak with her too, but just in case I don't get in touch with her you need to let her know that she needs to either drop off some diapers for you here, or send you to school with them every day. I'll be sure to tell her. Okay, well, I am sure I will be seeing you again soon enough, so go on back to class. Julia needed a second to figure out that Mrs. Barnard was right, she would be seeing her again. She had been paying attention to the new diaper she had on. It felt different than what she had been wearing just a minute ago. The new diaper seemed thinner or something. Julia quickly decided that she liked the diapers she normally wore a lot more. Oh, yeah, I guess so. Well, thanks and all. No thanks needed, Julia. Get back to class and remember to just come see me whenever you need to, okay? Okay, I will. Julia opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The door closed itself behind her, and she found herself standing alone in the hallway. The two empty chairs were still there, but Julia looked at them in a different way. She pictured herself sitting there waiting to have her diaper changed while somebody else was in the office. Even though she knew Mrs. Barnard was serious about the whole privacy thing, she also knew that folks in the office here had to be able to figure out why some kids were always coming in and sitting there. On the way back to class, Julia learned that the diaper she had on was also a lot louder than the ones she normally wore. It made a loud crinkling noise when she walked that she could hear pretty clearly. Julia also thought about it and decided that Mrs. Barnard was okay. She smiled a lot and seemed really nice. It was really cool how she didn't make a big deal out of the fact that a girl Julia's age was wearing diapers. She acted like it was pretty normal, really. And that was probably because in Mrs. Barnard's world, it was pretty normal. Which made Julia feel a little bit better about the idea of spending the rest of the week in diapers. The rest of Monday went fine. Julia got home, and after her mom changed her diaper, she had wet herself on the way home. She had a talk with her mom that included a small daughter-to-mother lecture about answering her cell phone and checking voicemail. It turned out that Mrs. Barnard had eventually gotten in touch with mom later that afternoon, so she was already in the loop about needing to drop off some diapers for Julia at school. They both agreed that was a better idea than having Julia bring them to school every day. Dad came home and they had dinner together. After dinner, Julia was upstairs on her bed reading a book for school when her body told her that she was soon going to have a stinky diaper. Unlike the previous couple of times though, Julia didn't really worry about it at all. About 10 minutes later she actually filled her pants without really even pausing from the book she was reading. Her mom changed her after she came down a few chapters later to get a drink. She watched a bit of TV after that and then headed off to bed. Tuesday started out just like any other day, except for a wet diaper in the night that got changed after breakfast. Julia went to school and sat through her classes just like she had the week before. Just after lunch, however, Julia soon found herself in another wet diaper and knew she needed to make a stop in Mrs. Barnard's office. She was again in Mrs. Norrie's class, and since she was already done with the assignment it seemed like as good a time as any to make a run over there. Plus most folks were still working quietly on the problems. She quietly walked to the front of the room and the teacher's desk. "Mrs. Norries, can I have the hall pass again?" Mrs. Norries looked up and then nodded her head. She grabbed the hall pass, an old eraser with the word hall pass taped to it, and handed it to Julia. Julia slipped out the door as quietly as she could. But she did see a couple of heads look up from their work to see her go. Her heart raced for a few seconds, until she told herself people take the hall pass all the time. I used to take the hall pass sometimes, so this isn't anything new or crazy. She quickly walked her way to Mrs. Barnard's door. Julia quickly arrived and tried the handle, but of course it was locked. She then knocked a few times, but the door opened before she even finished. Mrs. Barnard looked down at her and then closed one eye and stared at the ceiling with the other. "Don't tell me," she said. "Julia, right?" "Yeah, you got it," Julia replied with a smile. She was impressed that Mrs. Barnard remembered her name. "Well, come in, come in." She closed the door behind her. "I'm guessing you need to be changed." Mrs. Barnard didn't beat around the bush apparently. And while Julia wasn't exactly surprised by the statement, the whole idea of going to some stranger and knowing that they were about to change your diaper was still far from normal. "Ah, yeah," Julia replied somewhat uncomfortably. "Well, no time like the present, right?" Mrs. Barnard disappeared into the back room. She came out holding a diaper that looked familiar to Julia. "Oh, and your mom dropped off a bunch of diapers so we can use these. I like these a lot better than the one I had to use yesterday. Trust me, you don't want to have to wear cheap flimsy diapers. Well, go ahead and lay down on the bed and let's get this taken care of, shall we?" Julia was back in math class in hardly any more time than it would have taken if she had gone to the bathroom herself. The rest of the day went by somewhat slowly. She managed to stay dry until just before school was let out and then ended up wetting herself again on the way home, which she decided was fine since her mom would be home and would probably be checking her pretty much as soon as she walked in the door. When Julia did walk in the front door, she said hello. A reply hello came from the kitchen area. The sound of a knife chopping something on a cutting board told her that mom was working on dinner. Julia decided to just head upstairs and ditch her pants, since mom was likely to ask her to do so anyhow. While she was at it, she switched out her top and put on t-shirt. A quick glance in the mirror showed what was slowly turning into her normal look: socks, a t-shirt, blue in this case, and a diaper on the bottom. How weird is it that this is starting to look normal, Julia thought to herself, although after a few moments of inspection, she was still convinced the diaper made her butt look big. Julia headed down to the kitchen, figuring that was a surefire way to get her wet diaper checked, and thus get changed. Her mom was in fact working on dinner and seemed to still be cutting veggies on the counter when she walked in. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetie, how was your day?" Shirley said as she walked over and gave Julia a quick no-handed hug. She obviously didn't want to get whatever was on her hands on Julia's shirt. But using her wrists, she turned Julia around. It helped Julia knew what she was doing, and then examined her daughter's diaper. Yep, looks like you are wet." "Well, I'm in the middle of getting dinner ready, so that diaper is gonna have to wait a bit. I don't want to have to wash up again since I just did it. I'll change you once I get this in the oven though." Julia was about to say something about that being fine. The diaper wasn't completely soaked and would certainly last a few minutes until her mom was done. But before she could say anything, a new voice, from the other side of the kitchen, spoke up. "Shirley, if you want I could change her." The very first thing that came to Julia's mind was that the voice was not her dad. It wasn't even male. But it was very familiar, and a heartbeat later Julia recognized it. She knew who it belonged to even before she looked up and saw Fiona's mom, Nancy Heyman, sitting at the table looking at her and her mom. "Actually, Nancy, if you don't mind, that would be great. It's not a big job if you know what I mean." Shirley paused and then looked at Julia. Julia was stunned. She wasn't afraid, or mortified, or embarrassed. At least not yet. Things just had happened too fast for any feelings like that to set in. That Mrs. Heyman was over here wasn't a shock. Her mom and Fiona's mom were friends and often hung out together while the kids were at school. But it was not at all lost on Julia that she was standing in the kitchen wearing a clearly visible diaper, and her mom had just said, out loud, that she needed to be changed. And Mrs. Heyman had just offered to change her like it wasn't a big deal. Come to think of it, why wasn't Mrs. Heyman shocked, or at least a bit surprised? While Julia was thinking about all of this, Shirley eventually gave up on Julia doing whatever it was that she had thought she might do. "Nancy, everything is upstairs. Julia can show you." "And thanks, I wouldn't have thought to ask, but..." "Shirley, it's not like this is the first time," Nancy said with a smile and a slight nod of the head. With that, she stood up and walked over to Julia, who was still slowly processing what had just happened. Mrs. Heyman paused and looked at Julia briefly and then said, "So, where is everything?" "In my room." Julia finally managed and then turned and started walking to the stairs.